Good evening, everyone, and welcome. It's really a pleasure to welcome you to the first Qalam event of 2025, a series that brings together great writers whose narratives challenge and reshape our understanding of the world. Qalam, which means pencil or pen in Arabic, has always been more than a tool for writing. It is an instrument of record and resistance, of memory and imagination. Through it, writers have questioned authority and given voice to those denied one. And few contemporary novelists exemplify this better than our guest and GUQ's inaugural writer-in-residence, Kamila Shamsie. At past Qalam events, we have seen Kamila in conversation with Nobel laureate Abdulrazak Gurna, Pulitzer Prize winner Hisham Matar, and Palestine Festival of Literature founder Ahdaf Suwaif, who also authored The Map of Love, drawing out the nuances of their work with her signature insight. But tonight, the roles are reversed, the tables are turned. Her own words, her own stories take center stage. It is a fitting spotlight. Across 8 novels, Kamila has built a body of work that is as urgent as it is compelling. She is a writer whose stories traverse continents, whose characters carry history within them, and whose words lay bare the fault lines that shape our modern world. But Kamila is not only a storyteller. She is also an advocate for literature's place in public discourse. She has written fearlessly on the responsibilities of writers in politically volatile times, on the censorship that seeks to silence them, and on the ethical dilemmas of publishing in a world where some voices are amplified while others are erased. Tonight, Kamila is joined in conversation by Zahra Babar, the executive director of GUQ's Center for International and Regional Studies. Zahra's name is already well known to many in this room. Since joining GUQ in 2008, she has helped shape CIRS into a leading hub for critical research and scholarship, managing more than 60 projects on transnational and regional issues and overseeing landmark publications on migration, labor, and citizenship in the Gulf. With a career spanning more than 3 decades, Zahra's work extends far beyond the walls of academia. Her previous roles with the United Nations Development Programme and the International Labour Organization reflect her deep engagement with the policy dimensions of migration and social justice. Her research, widely published and highly cited, has brought vital attention to the human stories behind the statistics, interrogating labor hierarchies, displacement, and the shifting nature of belonging in our region and beyond. Her perspective is shaped not only by years of scholarship, but also a lifetime of movement. Her father was a diplomat, and she grew up between countries, an experience that gave her a deep personal understanding of the questions she explores in her research. She has a particular fondness for Beirut, where her father served as ambassador, a city whose layered histories of displacement, resilience, and reinvention resonate powerfully with the themes in Kamila's fiction. Most recently, Zahra has played a pivotal role in steering many of the installments of the Hiwarat conference series, including last September's Reimagining Palestine conference, an event that convened leading scholars and thinkers for urgent discussions on justice, accountability, and the future of Palestine. Like Kamila, Zahra asks the difficult but necessary question: who gets to belong? What does it mean to be home? And how do borders, whether legal, cultural, or psychological, determine our fates? This conversation promises to be a rare and thoughtful exchange between 2 extraordinary women whose work challenges the status quo, one through fiction, the other through scholarship. Although I venture to say that the two are very much interlinked, and there is scholarship in fiction, and there is fiction in scholarship. Kamila and Zahra will delve into the themes that run through Kamila's novels: exile, identity, political responsibility, and how fiction can serve as both a refuge and a battleground in turbulent times. Through this conversation, they will consider how the stories we tell shape our understanding of belonging, while those we choose to forget reveal the boundaries of exclusion. I have no doubt that we will leave this evening with new insights, new perspectives, and perhaps new questions to carry forward. Kamila, Zahra, it's an honor to have you both with us tonight. And to all of you here, welcome. Now please join me in welcoming Zahra Babar to the stage.
Thank you so much, Dean Masri, for that very warm welcome and kind introduction. And my warm welcome and assalamu alaikum to all of you. It is truly an honor and a deep pleasure to introduce Kamila Shamsie this evening, not just as an acclaimed writer, but as my recently acquired and yet almost immediately beloved friend. Kamila needs little introduction. Her 8 novels have captivated readers around the world for the past several decades. From Burnt Shadows, shortlisted for the Orange Prize, to the Women's Prize-winning Home Fire, to one of my personal favorites, A God in Every Stone, her work is deeply evocative, layered, and always unafraid to engage with history, politics, and the personal in complex ways that linger on in the reader's mind long after the last page. I still vividly remember the excitement of reading her first book, In the City by the Sea, back in 1998. If someone had told me then that decades later I would be sitting in Qatar at Georgetown University's campus having a conversation with Kamila Shamsie in front of an audience, I would have thought they were quite mad. Not because it wasn't immediately clear that her writing was going to propel her rapidly into the public domain, but rather at the absurdity of the thought that I, lounging there, book in hand, in my Islamabad armchair, would be the one gifted with the opportunity of sitting with her years later to discuss it. But back in 1998, I was completely engrossed in the work of this new Pakistani voice, a young woman, much like me, I was young once, writing about a Karachi I had known through my childhood visits to my grandmother's home, but that in the subsequent decade and a half had somehow lost claim to. By the time I was reading In the City, Karachi had transformed from that intimate space of my earliest years into a chaotic, alien, and frankly somewhat frightening space. Through Kamila's words, a city that had been lost to me in the meanderings of my own life was suddenly made legible and returned to me. And that is a feeling I've had again and again when reading her novels. Each one is like a door opening into a past that I hadn't even realized I had forgotten. So that moving through her pages feels as though I'm walking backward through my own life, remembering and reclaiming. That is the power of Kamila Shamsie's writing. It doesn't just tell us beautiful stories. It restores to us lost landscapes, lost histories, and sometimes even lost versions of ourselves. Please join me in welcoming her. Welcome, Kamila. Yeah, is it? I have to press this.
No, it's on.
Okay.
Thank
Well,
you.
I mentioned Karachi in the opening. So I think we should start with Karachi. I mean, this has been a city which has featured in many of your books, including the very first one that I mentioned, In the City by the Sea, but then again in your most recently published Best of Friends last year. So I'm interested in learning how your relationship as a writer with the city has evolved. What is it about Karachi that makes you keep returning to it?
It's a question I've been thinking about a lot myself. My first 4 novels were all set in Karachi, which is the city I grew up in. I moved away for university, but even then, every summer and winter, as soon as I could, I was on a plane back home. And it continued to be, even though I was traveling a lot, it was my base until I was 34 years old. So it really was, that was my city, that was my place. But also the Karachi I grew up in, and you alluded to this in your introduction, became a very violent place, particularly in the 90s. And I think partly it was wanting to make sense of it myself. Partly it was when I started writing, I was in America and I was missing it. It was quite straightforwardly that. And it's interesting because when I was growing up in Karachi, but with English as my dominant language. So I was reading novels and I wanted to write, but I wasn't reading novels written in Karachi. So I didn't know how to imagine it as a place where fiction was set. It was certainly helpful at a certain point to start to read Indian writers because there's enough analogy there. But still, the novel of Karachi was not a thing I had ever read. And in some way, it was, I think, the act of going away. I did my undergraduate at Hamilton College, and I had the good luck to have a wonderful Kashmiri poet, Agha Shahid Ali, as my friend and mentor. And he was writing a lot about his place, which was Kashmir, in the 90s, which was far more violent and in the throes of history than my place. And I think it was very important for me to see the ways in which he was doing that. And in particular, his insistence that no matter what your reasons for wanting to write about a place, when you sit down to write something, what matters is what the work wants and what is good for the work. And so trying to work out those things, but how am I going to write about Karachi, but in a way that makes sense for me, for the work, for any readership I might have. It became sort of my primary way of thinking about writing was of thinking through the city and how will I write in the English language about this city, which in fiction has very rarely been written about. And at that point, I hadn't written any of it. And then I just got it in my mind that I was a writer who wrote about Karachi. It's an interesting thing we do as writers. We tell ourselves stories about ourselves. And then we can sometimes, I think, get trapped within the stories we're telling us. I mean, we do this, people do this, I'm this kind of person. And because you've decided you are this kind of person, you behave in this kind of way. And one day you might notice, no, I was that kind of person. And I also felt I couldn't leave Karachi because I felt so strongly that this is my material, this is my source, this is what I write about. And then I was working on my 5th novel, Burnt Shadows, which was supposed to be a Karachi novel. But it was going to be a Karachi novel in which it was set in 1998 originally, which is when Pakistan and India tested their nuclear bombs. And the idea was that there was going to be a character whose grandmother was Japanese. He was Pakistani, but his grandmother was Japanese and had lived through the bombing of Nagasaki. And so he had a personal history that was completely at odds with the jingoistic history in which he was living. And at a certain point, I thought, who is this Japanese grandmother? And I thought, I think I need to write about her. And so it was only through starting what I thought was a Karachi novel that I sort of knocked myself off course and ended up writing a novel that started in Japan in 1945 in Nagasaki, and discovering that actually there are different ways of being a writer. This line, write what you know, again, it's a line that people get stuck in and think it means write what you already know, when it can mean learn new things in order to write new things.
So staying on the city's theme. So, Peshawar, that's a city I'm very intimately connected to. And I'm really interested in how you wrote a story that not only brings Peshawar to life, but brings it to life through like hundreds of years almost of previous history. And in 2014, you wrote A God in Every Stone. And I'm sure that a lot of Peshawarites would probably be thinking, how is this writer of Karachi going to tell us about this city? And I will tell you, as someone from Peshawar, that I think you just did the most incredible job with it. So how did you go about writing about Peshawar? What was your process? Did you have to do a lot of research? And what made you think about writing about Peshawar?
So there were the Karachi novels, and then there was a novel which unexpectedly started in Nagasaki in 1945. And then, because I had then blown myself so off course and I wasn't writing a Karachi novel, I went a bit wild. So it starts in Nagasaki in 1945, then it moves to Delhi in partition in 1947. Then it does ultimately move its way back to Karachi in 1983, and then it's 2000 to New York and Afghanistan. So it sort of went everywhere. But I was in Pakistan when the book came out, and this was in 2009. And I was on a talk show talking about the novel. And it was 2009 or 2010. Things were very bad in Peshawar then. There was a lot of violence. The Taliban were in South Waziristan. And so I was on this talk show. It was kind of a newsy talk show. So I was there to talk about my book. And then there was a sort of, politics guy who was going to talk about what was going on in Peshawar. And it was a very hot day, and we were filming. It wasn't live. And we had to, at a certain point, just stop filming because it was too hot. The cameras were, and turn on the fans for a while so everyone could breathe. And while that was happening, the host turned to me and he said, "This is so strange. Here we are talking about your book about a bomb that went off in Japan in 1945, and there are bombs going off in Peshawar today." And at that moment, I realized I know so much more about Nagasaki in 1945 than I do about Peshawar, although I grew up in the same country as this. There are ways, I think countries, there are different cities that occupy different bits of the landscape. You grow up in Karachi, you are aware of Lahore and Islamabad in a more central and obvious way. And to a lot of people from Karachi, Peshawar is talked about as though the Badlands, it's almost another country, it's almost Afghanistan, and there are all kinds of stereotypes. And I realized I know almost nothing about this place. And it just struck me as wrong that I knew more about Nagasaki in 1945. So I just started reading. I didn't necessarily know, or maybe I did, that a novel was going to come out. But one of the first things I discovered was that Peshawar is one of the world's oldest continuously living cities. And one empire after another has been, and I love history and archaeology. The world's deepest excavation trench, by the way, is in Peshawar. I have walked down it. It's like, it gives you goosebumps. I was walking with an archaeologist, and he was just pointing to the layers of strata, with the soil basically we were going down, and there are little remnants in the soil of shells or coins, and he was sort of pointing me down. He was just saying, British, Mughals, so and so, Delhi Sultanate, so and so, Scythians, Parthians, Indo-Greeks, Greeks, Persians. And then it stopped because they'd run out of money. But we walked down 2,500 years of history. And so I loved that. And the other thing I was very interested in was the Khuda Khidmatgar, so this movement of non-resistance in a part of the world that is known as a sort of, the stereotype is it's this very militaristic, gun in hand place. And yet there was a very powerful movement of non-resistance there as part of the end of empire. So I was interested in that. And at some point I became very interested in the fact that a lot of soldiers from what was then British India, and from the areas around Peshawar, went to fight in the First World War, just a few years before this movement of non-resistance. So this was all this research, and it created the stories, because as I was reading them, I was sort of creating links, and the way my brain works is the links I create are via narrative.
In addition to the sort of the cities and the landscapes, many of the books are constantly told around really important historical or political moments as context, as backdrop, colonialism, empire, world wars, the bombing of Nagasaki. So when you're working on these stories, as you're telling them, how do you manage the challenge of not having those incredibly sort of important historical moments sort of take over your characters' personal and emotional lives or the actual story you're trying to tell of them?
Yeah, I mean, there's a way in which it would be easy to just research forever and not even write. Um, I think the answer to that is I'm a novelist. So my interest is, the question is, what does the novel want to work as a novel? What does the novel need to work as a novel? Very often in my early drafts, there are all kinds of things that are there because I find them interesting. And as I go through one draft after another, more of those things just kind of drop out. And then I say, oh, well, I'll be talking about the books endlessly, and then I can bring up all that stuff and then I forget it eventually. But it is that question of, at the center of it has to be the characters and what's driving them on. So what is relevant to that?
And again, in A God in Every Stone. So you have these time lapses. We meet your characters, and in A God in Every Stone, I think it's like 15 years go by before we meet your central characters again. In Best of Friends, we leave Mariam, we leave them in the late 1980s in Karachi and meet them almost, Zahra and Mariam, 30 years later. So as a writer, what happens? How do you map out that in-between period? Do you think it through? Do you have to still think of those characters in some way? Have you ever written that period and just not put it into a book?
Yeah, one of the things that happens also as a writer is you fall into certain patterns. And the time jump had become a pattern. So the thing I'm working on now, I'm deliberately forcing myself not to do that. And it's quite hard because I just want to say, oh, I want to get to the good bit that happens, 10 years later. So it's interesting to sort of have to force yourself to stay there. Actually, with Burnt Shadows, it's a novel in 2 parts. The first draft was a novel in 4 parts. And I had in between stuff. There were still jumps, but there were jumps of maybe 5 or 7 years. But really, the story was in the first and the last part. And I wrote those in between bits, and then they were necessary. I mean, they were probably necessary for me as a writer because I learned a lot of things about the characters that helped me get to that last bit. But so I just got rid of them. And with the other one, with The God in Every Stone, you just sort of sit there and spend a lot of time thinking, what happens in between? And sometimes it's as you're writing the latter sections, you work out this question of what happens in between. But A God in Every Stone was actually supposed to be, no, I'm lying now. I'm totally making up what I've said to you. It was supposed to be a novel in about 6 sections. And they were supposed to be very, very short. And I wrote about 4 of them. And it was this strange thing where the more I was writing, the worse it felt. Till I got to about section 4 and I felt like I was dragging myself through treacle. And I sent it to my friend Nadeem Aslam, who's a wonderful writer. And I said, I know you're really busy in the middle of something, but can you just look at this and tell me what is going on, basically? And he just, there's nothing like having writers as friends who know a cry of desperation when they hear it and that they just have to stop whatever they're doing. And he wrote back to me 24 hours later and he said, you're going too fast. The novel is the first 2 sections. Slow down and make it that. So there are people who plan out what they're going to write. And there are people who don't. You will not know it from reading the finished novel. I cannot tell. I've been doing this a long time. I can't tell which book was planned by the author before and which wasn't because, by the end it has to work, whatever route it takes. I'm not a planner. So I start off with vague ideas and then I go down lots of very blind alleys and then I end up saying, right, that's 20,000 words deleted. They're all necessary, I tell myself in some way, but they're not. But that's just the process of sort of discovery. You're meandering all over the place. And in the course of the meandering, you discover what the book should really be. And then you try and write it.
So you don't, do you know your endings before you start writing?
Strangely, I often know the last line or the mood at that final moment, but I generally don't know how I'm going to get there or necessarily what it means.
And what's it like when you complete a book? I mean, how do you celebrate it? What do you do? Do you take time off? Do you go, I mean, what's the labor like? I mean, do you have breaks between books? Are you working on things simultaneously ever?
So I get someone the other day said to me, "Oh, well, I know there are many writers who, so write in a kind of, they sit down every day and do it, and then there are the writers who wait for inspiration to strike." And I said, "You show me one novelist who is a professional novelist who is waiting for inspiration to strike, and I will show you a liar." Right? It just doesn't happen. It doesn't happen that way. It might happen with poems, possibly. I can't say it doesn't, but it doesn't work with novels. You have to have a routine, and you sit down and you do it, and you do it every day. It's your job. It is the labor, and you get to the end of a draft, and there's the end of the first draft it's that first moment for me when someone will see it, and I always know the first drafts really don't work, but you're still sort of waiting for someone to come back and tell you how badly they're not working. The great disappointment with Home Fire was that the first draft did work. And I think largely that was because it was based on Antigone. It was based on a Greek tragedy. So I, in fact, did know what was happening. I had the structure. I had everything laid out. And so I didn't have that sort of searching for the story thing. So then the first draft was done, and there was some rewriting, but not a lot. And I've never enjoyed writing a book less as a result, because for me, the joy is in this isn't working. I don't know what I'm doing. Oh, look, something is emerging. That the process itself and the not knowing feels very exciting. I mean, there are a lot of things writers get told, like, if you're writing it and you're not enjoying it, your readers won't enjoy it. This is not true. It's not true, because you are, it's about how the process is working for you rather than how it's working as a text to be read. I'm sure you asked a question that I've completely forgotten now. Oh, the labor of it, how I celebrate. Well, the thing is, when I finish a draft, there is always, when the first draft is done, there is, even though I know it's going to come back and I'll be told all the things that are wrong, there is a sort of a great exhale. If I had to give one piece of advice to writers, it would be get to the end. Get to the end of your first draft. So many of the very best writers I've ever read, you have never read, because they never published, because they never got to the end. There was always the going back and I have to perfect it. You don't have to go back and perfect it. You have to write the first draft. And then you have to rewrite and rewrite and rewrite and rewrite until not the book is perfect, until the well is empty and you have absolutely nothing more to give. And moving around a comma is about as much as your brain can manage to think of with this novel. That's when people say, how do you know you're at the end? That's how you know. It's not that it's done, you're done.
Yeah. Have you ever wanted to go back and change an ending of any of the books?
No one has ever asked me this question before. It's interesting when people said, what would you do differently? But I like the idea of, would you change the ending? No, the endings are probably the only thing that I absolutely wouldn't change, because if you're doing it right, when you approach the ending, there is only one ending possible. I've written some books in which terrible things happen to my characters. Yes.
I've experienced that.
And I never go into the books thinking that's what I'm going to do. Even when I'm basing a story on a Greek tragedy, I think, this is my adaptation. I can do with it what I want. I can change the thing. And then you can't, because it's a Greek tragedy and its bones are tragic bones. But what happens is you start off a novel, and starting off is horrific, because anything is possible. You have no restrictions. I don't know who decided that freedom is a great idea. freedom is only a great idea if it's bounded in certain ways. Absolute freedom is terrifying and paralytic. You start a book, I don't have a plan. I have some characters, some scenes in mind, some connective tissue somewhere, but it could be 1980, it could be 2007, it could be Karachi, it could be London. They could be 12, they could be 73. Horrible, right? Horrible as a writer. You start and you think, will I delete this tomorrow? Will she be left-handed tomorrow? And the further on you go, the more you are cutting out options, you're making decisions, and you're restricting what's possible. And the ending, when you come to a point where you realize that there is only one ending possible. If it feels like there's several endings possible, you haven't worked it out yet. There really should be only one that works, which you have been drawing. The entire novel has been bringing you to this point of inevitability.
So with Home Fire, how did you decide to do this, to adapt? I mean, were you already thinking about Antigone, or was it you started working on this story and this idea, and then you saw the parallels?
So you said, when I finish a novel, do I take time off? So you finish a draft, then you do endless drafts and redrafts and redrafts, and then you do copy edits, and then you are exhausted. Now, because I'm older. In my 20s, I hadn't finished one before starting the next. But now I finish one, and then I stop. And there's a very long fallow period when I'm doing nothing. And I love it. I'm not doing nothing, but I'm not writing a novel. And then my brain starts to get twitchy, because there's a piece of my brain, and it is a piece of my brain that makes me happiest in certain ways that I don't use. My friend Gillian Slover, who's a wonderful writer, said, when I'm writing and it's going well, I feel most at home in myself. And I know what she means. And it's, you want to be at home in yourself in that way. So I'd finished A God in Every Stone. And then I was, a writer who wanted to write, but didn't know what I was going to write. And I got an email from a man called Jatinder Verma, who worked I was living in London. He worked at a theatre company in London called Tara Arts. And they did a lot of British Asian, South Asian theatre. And he said, come and have a coffee with me. And I knew who he was, and I knew his theatre. So I went along, and he said, I really like your writing. I like the way you do dialogue. Write a play for me. And I said, I don't know how to write a play. He said, yes, I thought you'd say that. So why don't you adapt a play? Because then someone else has done all the hard work. And he was the one who said, Greek tragedy is having a real revival in the theatre at the moment. Something like Antigone or the Oresteia set in a contemporary British Asian or South Asian context. And what I said to him was, Antigone, that's interesting. And what I was thinking was, which one is Antigone? I had read it as an undergraduate. I hope there are no undergraduates here who are, getting bad instruction. But I had not one memory. It was a play where sad things happened. But I wasn't going to tell him that. So I nodded and I said, well, let me think about it. And I went in the train home, literally looked up the Wikipedia plot summary. And this was a moment when it was 2012, maybe? No, it wasn't 2012. It was 2014, 15. And the newspapers in Britain were filled with stories of young British men. It was women, girls later. But at the point, it was young boys and young men who were going to Syria to join ISIS. And the Home Secretary had just issued a statement to say, wherever possible, we will strip them of their citizenship. And this was of great interest to me because I had just become a British citizen, which was not an easy process. And I thought, what do you mean strip of citizenship? What is this? So it was in my mind, that whole story. And I'd seen a really moving news piece about a young girl whose brother had been one of those to go. And she's basically showing the news cameras around his bedroom. And you can just tell she doesn't know if she's seeing her brother again. And I was looking at the plot summary for Antigone, and I just thought, but this is it. This is this story. And the two, those sort of what was happening. I mean, it's never happened to me in this way before. But the things I'd been seeing in the newspapers and this story of 3,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago just came together and became one story so easily that it almost felt too obvious.
Will you read a bit of Home 5 for us?
I'll read a little bit. I should say you don't need to know Antigone. Some of the nicest responses are when people say, I read the book, it was only right in the last scene I saw, I thought, oh my God, this is Antigone. So you don't need to know a thing about Antigone. Although one of the curious things about reading it, of course, among the people who read the book were classicists who knew a lot more about Antigone than I did and knew a lot and could read it in Greek, which I couldn't. And they keep coming up to me and say, it was so clever how you used, and then they tell me something that I have used from classical Greek. And I think, yes, that's really interesting. So I'm going to read from right in the beginning of the novel so then I don't have to set it up. And this is... there's not a lot you need to know, except I suppose it might be helpful to know. It's set in an airport in London, at Heathrow Airport. That's all. Isma was going to miss her flight. The ticket wouldn't be refunded because the airline took no responsibility for passengers who arrived at the airport 3 hours ahead of the departure time and were escorted into an interrogation room. She had expected the interrogation, but not the hours of waiting that would precede it, nor that it would feel so humiliating to have the contents of her suitcase inspected. She'd made sure not to pack anything that would invite comment or questions. No Quran, no family pictures, no books on areas of academic interest. But even so, the officer took hold of every item of Isma's clothing and ran it between her thumb and fingers, not so much searching for hidden pockets as judging the quality of the material. Finally, she reached for the designer-labeled down jacket that Isma had folded over a chair back when she entered, and held it up, one hand pinching each shoulder. "This isn't yours," she said, and Isma was sure she didn't mean because it's at least a size too large for you, but rather, it's too nice for someone like you. "I used to work at a dry cleaning shop. The woman who brought this in said she didn't want it when we couldn't get rid of the stain." She pointed to the grease mark on the pocket. "Does the manager know you took it?" "I was the manager." "You were the manager of a dry cleaning shop, and now you're on your way to a PhD program in sociology in Amherst, Massachusetts?" "Yes." "And how did that happen?" "My siblings and I were orphaned just after I finished uni. They were 12 years old, twins. I took the first job I could find. Now they've grown up. I can go back to my life." "You're going back to your life in Amherst, Massachusetts." "I meant the academic life." The woman dropped the jacket into a jumble of clothes and shoes and told Isma to wait. That had been a while ago. The plane would be boarding now. Isma looked over at the suitcase. She'd repacked when the woman left the room and spent the time since worrying if doing that without permission constituted an offense. Should she empty the clothes into an haphazard pile, or would that make things even worse? She stood up, unzipped the suitcase and flipped it open so its contents were visible. A man entered the office carrying Isma's passport, laptop and phone. She allowed herself to hope, but he sat down, gestured for her to do the same, and placed a voice recorder between them. "Do you consider yourself British?" the man said. "I am British." "But do you consider yourself British?" "I've lived here all my life." She meant there was no other country of which she could feel herself a part, but the words came out sounding evasive. The interrogation continued for nearly 2 hours. He wanted to know her thoughts on Shias, homosexuals, the Queen, democracy, the Great British Bake Off, the invasion of Iraq, Israel, suicide bombers, dating websites. After that early slip regarding her Britishness, she'd settled into the manner that she'd practiced with Anika playing the role of the interrogating officer and Isma responding to her sister as though she were a customer of dubious political opinions whose business she didn't want to lose by voicing strenuously opposing views, but to whom she didn't see the need to lie either. For instance, when people talk about the enmity between Shias and Sunni, it usually centers around some political imbalance of power, such as Iraq or Syria. As a Brit, I don't distinguish between one Muslim and another. Or, occupying other people's territory generally causes more problems than it solves. This served for both Iraq and Israel. Killing civilians is sinful. That's equally true if the manner of killing is a suicide bombing or aerial bombardments or drone strikes. There were long intervals of silence between each answer and the next question as a man clicked keys on her laptop, examining her browser history. He knew she was interested in the marital status of an actor from a popular TV series, knew that wearing a hijab didn't stop her from buying expensive products to tame her frizzy hair, knew that she had searched for how to make small talk with Americans. Eventually the door opened and the woman official walked in. Perhaps she would be the one to ask the family questions, the ones most difficult to answer, the most fraught when she'd prepared with her sister. "Sorry about that," the woman said unconvincingly. "Just had to wait for America to wake up and confirm some details about your student visa. All checked out. Here." She handed a stiff rectangle of paper to Isma with an air of magnanimity. It was the boarding pass for the plane she'd already missed. Isma stood up, unsteady because of the pins and needles in her feet, which she'd been afraid to shake off in case she accidentally kicked the man across the desk from her. As she wheeled her luggage out, she thanked the woman whose thumbprints were on her underwear, not allowing even a shade of sarcasm to enter her voice.
So you and I have this experience where we went to university and spent time, be it in England or America, in the sort of pre-9/11 state of life, and then had to confront different things then, and then different things post 9/11, which I think is quite different from younger people who've just experienced the post 9/11 world. And obviously what this book is just, I think, it's an incredibly hard read, an incredibly brilliant read. And as you know, I focus more on the whole grief element of it, but it does obviously focus a lot on how these things are felt in the everyday as these indignities, which are not meant to pierce. And then also how the public discourse around it is sort of galvanized. In the context of flipping some themes in Home Fire to the context of Pakistan, one of the things that struck me profoundly is that your book on Peshawar, God in Every Stone, came out in 2014, which was the year of the Zarb-e-Azb military onslaught in what was then North Waziristan. And the appalling thing as a Pathan was to see the intense dehumanization within Pakistan. Again, no one's supporting terrorism, but the fact that a million people displaced by the military, shops, homes destroyed within Pakistan, and what I would really say is almost like an Islamophobic discourse within the country. I started avoiding certain houses in Islamabad during that period because I used to think it was so obnoxious what people would say. So when I read Home Fire, and then I obviously had a God in Every Stone mind, I was thinking about how some of these things happen in Muslim majority countries as well, that the being othered, not belonging, we do it to ourselves as well.
Yeah, I mean, it was my part of the reason I wanted to learn about Peshawar, because I was aware of that othering within that was happening towards Pashtuns and the city of Peshawar and places around it. And I was also aware that post 9/11, there was such a sense for good reasons, we are the beleaguered, we are the press, but then it's so interesting the way this happens with individuals as well as larger groups and communities is what is the response to feeling yourself under the boot of history? It should create a sense of solidarity with other people under the boot of history, but very often it creates the desire to be the boot. And I think a lot of the books are possibly about that. It was strange with America. I went to America as a student in 1991. And if you had grown up when I did in Pakistan in the 80s, America was such a strong political presence in our lives. And it was a strong cultural presence in our lives. In the streets of Karachi in the late 80s, you could find people selling masks, paper masks, of Sylvester Stallone looking quite Pakistani. And that was when the Rambo movie came out, in which he was fighting of the Russians in Afghanistan, and there was all the fellow feeling. And I arrived in America, and it's funny the things people talked about culture shock and what culture shock did you experience. There were all kinds of culture shock I didn't experience because I had traveled before and I had a sister who'd been at university and all kinds of things. I wasn't prepared for the fact that Pakistan was not anywhere in a single person's consciousness. And it was a single, but we think so much about you. And you play such an important role in our lives, and we are nothing to you. And there's such a, and then I was at a university which I loved. And I loved my professors, and I loved that I was encouraged to engage in critical thinking in a way I never had before. And I gravitated very quickly to the lefties and the progressives, and even though it was not, Hamilton College is not a progressive university, but you could find those pockets, and the pockets were amazing. And I became very aware, I think, of this two double brain self. There was what America looked like if you were outside America, but then what America could look like to you. And I thought I was quite, sophisticated in my thinking. And then 9/11 came along, and I found that I was quite blindsided by the swiftness with which America turned even on Muslims within. And I realized this is a far more complicated story, and that my feelings for this country are also quite complicated, because there was the push and the pull. There was the growing up, loathing the fact that America backed the military dictatorship and watching a different Hollywood movie every single night. And then 9/11 happened, and I think I had to do quite a lot of reflecting and growing up. And then there was the issue of, I was 28 at the time. I was a novelist. I had moved to London, but I happened to be in London. And suddenly you're in demand because there's this, where are the Muslim voices? Let us get a Muslim woman. Let's get a secular Muslim woman. And it took me a while to realize how pernicious that was, because for a while you think, oh, they want to hear from me. Oh, I get to give the other side of the story. And it's a while before you work out the way in which you are this token presence. And people can say, look, no, we're very fair and balanced. Look, we got, at 29, I was appearing on TV shows with Strobe Talbot and James Woolsey and Ehud Barak. And I'm like, what? At that time, it felt great. You're 28, and there's these very leading political figures from America and Israel, and you're there. And then much later you think, really, you didn't know anyone else? You didn't think it was important to put anyone who was at that level? And so, the process of being Muslim, which is not something you have to think about in that way when you're in Pakistan. In Pakistan, you can just, you can really dislike this kind of Muslim and that kind of Muslim and have all your bigotries and your prejudices. And then you suddenly become part of the Muslim world while outside. And then it's interesting to go back home. to Pakistan and see, so what has this done to you? This being under the boot, this really feeling the boot of power on you. What has it done to your sense of solidarities? What has it done to your understandings of how power work? And very often the answer was, well, it hasn't done very much.
Yeah. I remember a long time ago, sitting in my parents' front lawn in Peshawar after my father had retired, and one of the guards came up and said in Pashto, "Seba, khalaq raghali di Pakistan now," and I said, "What?" I turned because he had said, "People have come to see you from Pakistan," and I said, "Where does he think we're sitting? We're in Peshawar," and he's like, "Ah." And he's saying outside the frontier is Pakistan. So it's there are many layers of it, right? Of this is not it's not always, we haven't always succeeded.
Yeah. No,
we've always.
I mean, it's also that the other thing that's interesting and has often been interesting to me is the whole idea of a nation state and the idea of citizenship and the idea of identification. I'm now British and I'm Pakistani. And that was an interesting thing. So on the day I became British, and it was I really, really wanted to be British because anyone who has traveled the world on a Pakistani passport and does a lot of traveling knows this is not a good situation. Partly I wanted with passport, but I also wanted because London had become my home. It was where I was living, and I wanted the right to go on living there. And I wanted to have every single right I could have in the country in which I was living, which is what, frankly, everyone should want. And the only way to have that was by being British. And so I was very keen on it. And because I wasn't giving up my Pakistani passport, there was no sense of, I didn't go into thinking, oh, I'm giving one thing up. And it was, I get to be both. This is great. And I, happily walked. There was a citizenship ceremony. And I very happily walked into the room where the citizenship ceremony was happening. And it was in Camden Town Hall, which is right across the street from the British Library. And this is relevant because it was 2013. I was still working on A God in Every Stone, which was the novel of the British colonial presence. And in that library across the road, I had been reading about massacres committed by the British that were then covered up. And I walked in the space across the room, and there was a man there, photographer, taking pictures of everyone coming in, and he handed me the Union flag, right, the British flag. The thing about living in Britain is you rarely see the flag. It is not a flag-waving nation at all. So it's quite startling when you see the flag, particularly 10 years ago, 11 years ago. And he handed me this flag, and I suddenly felt terrible. And I hadn't been prepared for that at all. And the whole ceremony happened, and there was no feeling of, I've got it, this thing has happened. And I went home, and I still, it was done, and I was feeling really icky and disappointed. It was incredibly anticlimactic and upsetting in some strange way. But I went immediately and I printed out the form to get a passport. And I took it to the post office, and there was a man who took it in, who worked at the post office, who I'd seen often. His name was Khalid. And, we'd never really spoken, but I'd seen him around. He'd taken in my letters year after year. And he looked at the envelope, and it was written on it. And he said, "First passport?" And I said, "Yes." And Khalid said, "Welcome." And I just wanted to cry. I mean, everything that I hadn't felt in the ceremony. And there was something so sort of London and complicated about it. And yet I still felt that I was a Londoner, but that my Britishness was a fact of citizenship. It was an official fact. It was a government fact. It wasn't an emotional fact. I'm Pakistani. And then I started to write Home Fire. And it was while I was writing Home Fire, at some point I had the feeling I am writing this book about Britain from within. Which was very different to writing, Burnt Shadows, where I was writing about other places. And I was aware of writing about other places, hopefully without othering in that way. And in some way, it was almost as though I had to write about contemporary Britain in order to feel implicated in it in some way, in order to feel some different kind of emotional connection. So it's a strange thing. What does it mean to be British? What does it mean to be Pakistani? Some days it means absolutely nothing at all.
And
And other days,
yeah, I have dual citizenship too, and I acknowledge that there's a responsibility, but you can't just treat these things as passport citizenship, right?
Yeah.
With all the ambiguities and the challenges that come with it, you have to also think, what are you claiming here? You can't just say, well, I disavow you, I've got the paper and I'm going to travel with this document. You have to have some understanding of how you're going to navigate this.
Yeah.
In several of your books, but obviously even in Home Fire, it's in the title, you talk about home and mobility and migration. And these are obviously themes. I guess we are almost like the first generation of born Pakistanis. Our parents experienced the partition at a very young age. So it's natural that we're going to be thinking about things like movement, identity, homelessness. So in your novels, again, home is something that's flexible. It gets redefined. It gets interrogated. But what do you think? I mean, do you think it is possible to have multiple homes and not feel a bit fragmented or unmoored?
Is it possible to be a human being and not feel fragmented? Right? I mean, you are a different person with your grandmother. Even when you're a child, you know that there is you with your grandmother and there's you with your best friend and there's you with your dog, and but I don't think of it as, I suppose, but I wouldn't call that fragmentation. There is a great multiplicity. I'm a novelist, so multiplicity is where I live. If you made me write something that was a dramatic monologue and I was only in one person's head, not thinking about anyone else's head, I don't know how I do with that. I love the fact that there are different places that call to me in different ways. There's a sense of loss, but we're moving through time, so there's going to be a sense of loss. I'm never going to be 15. The Karachi that was my Karachi when I was 15 is not there for anyone. I really like being an outsider as well. I think we really undervalue the importance of being able to stand apart a little, the outsider-insider position. And in some ways, I think I can say this because I had the luxury of growing up in one place and having an absolutely stable sense of place. Karachi was home. I was of it. It was of me. No one questioned it. I didn't question it. I think it's very, very different if you grow up differently. So, at a certain point, I could start to choose to move around. And that became a question of choice. I could choose to be outsidery in certain places. I could choose all kinds of things. But there was this very central, stable core that it came out of. And I think that has given me this freedom and flexibility of, give me more places to claim as my own. But I also think as you get older, you start to think, okay, maybe not too many more places. I may be done now.
Yeah, I think we've reached the same place. I probably had the opposite because I had to move every 2 years or 3 years. And so I think by the time I started thinking about things like migration and mobility, I was searching for tethering. And then, of course, that didn't happen. I feel like I've monopolized you a lot, Kamila. So maybe we should take this opportunity. We have a wonderful audience here. And I think there's some mics around. Should we bundle a couple of questions? If you have something you'd like to ask Kamila, if you could just put up your hand and maybe we'll take like 2 or 3 questions together. Yeah.
Hi, I wanted to ask you about Home Fire.
You talked about characters and how you move between characters and, the plot and everything. I was wondering if you, I know it's the novel is based on Antigone, so you must have known that Annika is your main character. But I wonder if you consider for Isma to be your main character, because the first part of the novel was so interesting. Her story, her relationship with her mentor. While I was reading it, even towards the middle of the story, I was still waiting, for coming back to Isma's story. Especially that Annika, I just disliked Annika. She's like, I'm sorry, but she's like so impulsive. And although I can understand why she behaved that way, but also I couldn't understand why she behaved that way. So I'm just interested about knowing that. Thank you.
Let me just do that, and we can, because otherwise I'll lose track of them because my memory's not what it was. Um, so, in the original play, for those who don't know, there are these two sisters, and there's Antigone, who's this main character, and then there's her sister Ismene. And basically, Antigone wants to do the revolutionary thing, and her sister does not. And in a lot of the writing around it, basically the sister gets a really bad rap. The sister sort of called the compliant one and the one who... But if you read the play, it's sort of interesting when you get an idea, I'm going to do this as a novel, but it still has to spark. Something has to spark to life. So I was reading all these translations of Antigone, and there's this one moment when the two sisters are having an argument. And this was the Anne Carson translation, which was the only translation I read which was by a woman. And I think something was different in it. I know something was different in it, particularly in the way it drew out the two sisters. So the two sisters are having an argument. The one who wants to do the kind of revolutionary thing that is likely to get her killed. Her sister is sort of, saying, but I'm always on your side, even though she does not do it. And Antigone says, well, you've chosen, you're not against me, you're not with me. Now what do you care what I do? And Anne Carson gives the sister, the compliant sister, the one who is saying to Antigone, do not do this thing which will get you killed. She has a sentence that is 4 words. I'll be so lonely. And in that moment, you know that what she's thinking about is you're doing something that will get you killed. And I will miss you. And our brothers have just died. You are the only family I have left. And you're going to get yourself killed. And I thought, you can't call her just the compliant one and the one who sticks by the rule. This is a story of family as well. And the reason Antigone is doing what she's doing in my reading of it, it's not because she wants to bring down the institutions of state. It's because she loves her brother. And it's a really... I was smiling at the question, not because it's a bad question, but because it's a really good question. Because when I started, I at first did think, I want to tell the other sister's story and make it clear that she was not compliant. She was not the one who just did what she was told to do. But then I want to tell the other stories too. And part of what happens with novels is you set certain rules and you have to stick with them. And this was a pass the baton kind of story that you heard from one character and then you heard from others. So I couldn't bring it back to her. And the other thing is I knew she had to be absent because if she had been there, much of this would not have happened. She was sort of the moderating presence. And I also was laughing by the point with Anika, because the thing with Anika is I know in my head who Anika was before this terrible thing happened. But in the way the story is told, I can only show you her in the middle of the terrible thing when she's just responding. Her entire response is about the terrible thing. And every other part of her has disappeared. And again, it's the frustration of writing novels, is there are all these other things you want to bring in, but the novel doesn't want it. Even if the readers want it, the novel doesn't want it.
Hi, thank you. So I want to comment on the idea of fragmented identity. I only read Home Fire. And the way I read it, and maybe that's me, the linguist, talking, I didn't see it as fragmented. I saw identity as more emergent and as very situated, depending on salience, whatever is happening, whether it's with Anika or Isma or even the rest of the family. So I'm not sure I have a question there, but did you at any point, was there any intentionality in how you made them interact with their surroundings, whether at the beginning in the airport where Isma, the part that you read, or later on how they dealt with each other, or dealt with how Isma dealt with Amherst, or all of that was, or did your characters just did they just lead you to, the way they are? Because you said you're not a planner, but this one was planned more.
Well, I'm not a planner with first drafts. Everything is ultimately planned. It's just that, with the other novels, the first draft becomes the thing that then has to get, hewed and whittled in different ways, and then the plan has to emerge. It's an interesting question with intentionality, because I think often the assumption is either that there's intentionality or that you're kind of led by your characters. I know many of you were at the talk that Hisham Mathal did last term. I once heard Hisham doing in a conversation with someone, and the interviewer said, when you were writing X, were you thinking this or that? And Hisham said, when I write, I try not to think. And everyone laughed except the writers in the room, who knew exactly what he meant. And he doesn't, certainly what I thought he meant, or what made sense to me, which is there is a thinking that goes on without you looking at it, right? Am I thinking about any of the things that I'm saying even now to you? Well, I don't know. I mean, the answers I'm giving are constructed of things I've thought about before. And there's a certain amount of my brain kind of trying to go ahead to the next sentence to work out what it might be. There is thinking going on, but I'm not thinking about the thinking, if you understand what I mean. So afterwards, if you say to me, when you were writing, I can't tell you. I really cannot look at a book I've written and tell you what I was thinking or why I made certain decisions. I just know that the decisions get made, they come on the page, and some of them instantly feel wrong. Some of them the next day feel wrong. Some of them I can be quite precise of, no, this won't work because. And other things, it's just no.
Can I tell you why I asked that question?
Yes.
It's more, so Edgar Allan Poe did not like to write novels. He wrote short stories because he always thought of the ending first and built up the story intentionally, step by step, toward that ending. That was his plan. At least that's what he said. He claimed. Maybe he's a liar, like you said earlier.
No, I didn't say. I mean, there are lots of writers who do that.
Right.
So, yeah.
I mean, no, I don't know. I mean, maybe, right?
Maybe. Yeah.
And I always look at novels and think, and thank you for saying earlier that you just write and let things happen and let the novel basically talk to you. Because to me, it's always a feat. And I write, but I write more academic stuff, and I go through the same process. So I thought, quite interesting. The final product is different. So I thought if there is intentionality, I would like to hear about.
So maybe the answer, maybe the closest I can give to giving an answer is the first draft is the most kind of feeling my way around in the dark. There'll usually be maybe 5 major drafts, and within each of those major drafts, there'll be sort of 3 or 4 or 5 mini drafts. So there's a lot of writing, there's a lot of rewriting, there's a lot of going over the same page 20, 25, 30 times, which means at some point you are making, the later you get in the process, I think, the more you're aware of the intentionality. You become aware that, all right, certain things are missing, or certain things are too baggy, or certain things are weak, or certain things have to be strengthened. So it's I think the process is, it starts with you're much less aware of why you're doing the things you're doing, and then as you proceed, and of course at a certain point editors come in and ask you questions. Why is that happening? And then you have to think of an answer.
Hello, thank you. First, I just want to say thank you to both of you for actually making, I think, so many people in this room feel seen in all the ways that you're talking about home and multiplicity and all of our different selves, right, that come out in different times. My question is about language and the creative process and how you think about your characters. Do you think about them all in English? Or do you think about them as you're creating all the characters, but also the narrative in different languages? And I'm asking this question just because I know that different languages make me a different person when I speak them and think in them. And so I guess just asking you to reflect on that in your work.
Mine is the very boring answer that English is so much my dominant language that it's almost always what I'm thinking in. But there will be times, of course, with my characters where something in Urdu will occur, but not tremendously often. But there was an interesting thing that happened. In Burnt Shadows, there are characters who speak German, which I do not speak. And I was in Germany when the German translation came out. And there was an actor, and she was going to read out a section. And it was a section in which the characters were speaking German to each other. And she just turned to me and she said, "So what I'm about to say, that's what they really said." Right? You don't know it. So that was an interesting kind of move. But I think I'm very conscious of use of the linguist being there as I'm saying these things. But it's also interesting with language about how different words, even if you're speaking English, a word will resonate differently in different contexts. You know, an English-speaking group in Pakistan, a certain word will land, something as basic as family, lands differently. And you do also, but then there'll be times when I'm writing, I'm thinking, well, at this moment, when these characters are using the word family, because I'm writing a novel in English, actually, even if they were super English feeling, right now they would be saying khandan, which is more than family. I mean, it has weight. Khandan has serious weight. So there are moments when you know this is going on. And certain things are getting lost along the way. It's also one of the things as a writer, you have to decide how comfortable you are with knowing that your readers, some of your readers, many of readers will not know what you mean by the things you're saying on the page. You have two ways of doing things. You can have a kind of lowest common denominator of, let me just write in really obvious ways so everyone picks up everything. But it's one of the weirdnesses of the novel. It's one thing that with the novel, I slightly, increasingly, I'm sort of in a very productive kind of war with the form itself. We talk of good writing as writing in which there is a lot of subtext, for instance, right? Where things aren't spelled out. But that's relying on an audience who understands the subtext, which is often a very close group. So if I want to write a scene in Karachi, which is very class-coded, which has all its subtext, Zahra would understand it. My cousin Akbar there would understand it. A few other people would understand it. To a lot of people, it wouldn't come through. So then as a writer, you think, well, do I still do this and say it's okay? Nothing is riding on this in a major way. So if some people aren't getting it, that's fine. Or do I try and write in that lowest common denominator way that everyone who I'm assuming is reading is going to get it? It's strange, this business of codes. And I think it's one of the things you think of if you are writing from one place into another place. The question that always gets asked instead is, well, are you writing for Western readership or Western market? That's not the issue. The issue is, what do I do with these subtexts, which again, it's not just that they won't be understood outside Pakistan, they may not be understood outside that particular class grouping. In Home Fire, very early on, these two characters meet in America. They're both from London, and they sit down, and one is from Holland Park, and the other one is from Wembley. And if you are from London, you know what that means. You might be from Manchester and not know what that means. Am I going to explain it? Am I going to leave it as it is and hope that other things that are happening in the scene or that are happening in the novel will make it come out? It's this interesting decision making you have to do about as a writer. I'm really gone away from your question, Nadia, but more than language, it is that question of subtext and what can be inferred and what can be assumed that I become interested in.
In Best of Friends, you talk about Zahra's family shopping at Dawson's, and you talk about Mariam's family going to Agha's. Now, what I love is that you don't explain it. So people who get it. It makes no difference. These are supermarkets in Karachi, and there's a class difference of who goes to which one. But if you had explained it, I think it would have started alienating other potential readers.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Thank you again for the nice thought. I think my question, and since I have a writer right in front of me, so I can ask you, is as a writer, when you write characters, some characters are so deep, so impactful. So as a reader, when we're reading them, we get immersed in them. We almost imagine ourselves to be them, or, when you're going to sleep, you have that lingering thought about them. So as a writer, do you ever feel that a character that you've written, that you've invented, has such a deep impact on you yourself? Like, would you say that as a writer, do your emotions mimic the emotions of a reader? Like, once you're done with the book and you pick up the book to read the final draft, do you feel the same emotion that a reader would feel? Or do you feel like now that you've created it, you've read it, you've seen it so many times, you almost feel like you're stoic to that emotion, or emotion is not as impactful or as deep as the reader? Or do you become the character to say?
It's a good question, but I've never read one of my novels. I mean, I've never read it as a novel. I read it as a thing I'm working on, and then the thing that needs correcting. It's interesting you asked that, because the other day, because Zahra texted me because she was reading A God in Every Stone, which is my favorite of my novels, and I picked it up, and because it's been 10 years or 11 years, I found I'd forgotten things. I was really enjoying it. But then I put it down because there are a lot of other books in the world that I have never read that I want to read. So I'm not going to go and spend time rereading myself. But those emotions you speak of, it's in the writing. You get very caught up. I was once writing something, and the writing was going well. So I thought I was in a very buoyant and happy mood, because I knew that sometimes you just know that the sentences are coming out as you want them to come out. Doesn't happen often, but this time it really was. And my sister was in the room with me, and suddenly she looked up and she said, "What's wrong?" And I said, What do you mean, what's wrong?" And she said, "Are you very sad about something?" And I realized that even though the writing was going very well and there was a part of me that was very happy, I was also killing off a character I loved. And it was something came off me that was so strong that she just literally sort of just looked up. It was almost a sort of physical thing she said. There, I get it's a weird duality because I'm both being caught up in the writing, but if it's going well, I mean, you feel it, and you feel it particularly when you do something terrible to a character, because there are moments when you don't, when a story is moving in one direction and a horrible thing can happen, and you find a way to rescue it in a way that isn't forced or false, but that really it feels, this awful thing could happen, and then you found a way to make it swerve, and the awful thing didn't happen. And there's a lightness to that moment, because it becomes a reminder that actually things can swerve this way. And then there are other times when you're writing and there's not a thing you can do, and you can't save them. And more than once with a book, I've thought I can make it okay for them, and I can't. And that feels really, really bad. But then once a book is out in the world, it really does stop being mine. There's, you asked me about what feels like when a book goes. There is always a certain kind of sadness because I spend so much time. It's not that I've become the character Safwan, but it's an interesting thing where I have spent so much time intimately in their company. And now they've gone and they're going out in the world and they become other people. They really do, because then the act of interpreting them goes to the reader. And people will come up to me and talk to me about my characters, and I realize you're reading them differently to the way I did, but you're also reading them absolutely right. I mean, there's I leave enough space between words on a page precisely so you can have a different form of interpretation there. But it becomes lost to me. That intimacy is only there as long as I'm writing it.
Well, I saved the hardest question for last. Are you going to put the recipe for your biryani in your next book or not?
You're not going to be prepared for this response that comes your way. Some years ago, Jeanette Winterson, the writer, was putting together a book of Christmas stories and Christmas recipes. And Jeanette and I were teaching together at the time, and she came to me and she said, I want something Christmassy that's not sort of English. So give me a Pakistani recipe. I said, Pakistani Christmas recipe? She said, just make one up. She said, I've heard you do a good biryani. And I said, really, is it a Christmas recipe? And then I think she was the one who said, or maybe I said as a joke, should I do turkey biryani? And she said, that's a brilliant idea. I'd never made a turkey biryani. It sounded like an awful idea to me. But just for the sake of her book, I wrote a recipe which basically was chicken biryani, but I replaced the chicken with turkey. And then it was published. And then she called me up one day and she said, no, it wasn't published. It was about to be published. And she called me up and she said, so you need to sit down. I said, what? She said, well, the Financial Times wants to run a piece on this book of mine, but they said they want me to cook one of the recipes in there. And the recipe they want me to cook is your turkey biryani. I'm not cooking that. So you're coming over and the journalist from the Financial Times is coming over and we're going to make turkey biryani. I said, I don't know if it's any good. And she said, I don't care. You have to. And it was slightly different to a normal because it was with leftover turkey. So I was really just making things up. So then I went along and we got some, leftover turkey. And I made a turkey biryani, and the recipe is online in the Financial Times. And there are friends of mine who every year in London, the day after Christmas, text me and say, made your turkey biryani. This is what I say about turkey biryani. It is perhaps the worst thing you can do with the biryani, but the best thing you can do with a turkey.
Thanks. Well, I waited 28 years to have this conversation, but it was well worth the wait. I'm sure I speak on behalf of everyone in this room to say it's just been an extreme privilege and pleasure to listen to you talk about your work, talk about your journey. And just, thank you for being with us. Thank you for your time, Kamila. Thank you for writing these books that transport us, challenge us, and engage with the very crux of the things that make us human. Thank you.
Thank you, Zahra. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
And thank you all for joining us, and have a wonderful evening.